Hi, everyone. Today's fallacy is what's known as begging the question. Um, I'll, as usual, give an example in a minute, but first, just define broadly what the fallacy is. So, begging the question occurs when somebody defends a conclusion by using premises that are just as controversial as the conclusion itself. So, often, begging the question is a form of circular reasoning. um, where the premises depend upon something that is very similar to or even identical to the conclusion itself. So, in other words, when the question is begged, when that fallacy is committed, it's often the case that you'd only accept the premise, or one or more of the premises, if you already accepted the conclusion. And that makes it not a very good argument um, because the whole point of having premises is to provide support or even proof for the conclusion that's being argued for. Um, and if your premises are just as controversial as your conclusion, then you're not going to convince anyone new with that argument. So it's a bad argument. It includes that mistake of presupposing that very thing which you were trying to conclude, what you were trying to argue for. So that's a bit abstract. I'll give an example. So some years ago, I ran into a person at an airport who started talking to me about religion. I'm not sure why, but that suddenly they were there talking about that. And they made the argument that God must exist because the Bible says so. And this kind of fallacious argument, which is a case of begging the question, is pretty common with issues like this. Because you can see that if I'm not sure if God exists, right, if you need to convince me with some kind of argument, so that's your conclusion, you want to try and show me that, yes, God does exist. If your premise depends upon something like, well, the Bible says so, that's not going to be a very good argument because I'm not going to place much stock in the Bible if I don't already believe in God, right? So I might ask, why should I believe in the Bible? Somebody might double down on that and say, well, because God wrote it, right? But obviously, God writing the Bible presupposes that God actually exists, right? I assume you can't write something if you don't exist. So, as you can see, this is a case of begging the question where you have a circular reasoning going on, right? We're presupposing that God exists or something pretty close to that, or something as equally controversial, and using that as evidence that God must exist. So it's not a very good argument, right? And it's something to avoid. One thing about the term begging the question, so in recent years, that term has been used more broadly. And a lot of times when people say, well, that begs the question of something, what they mean really is that this raises the question, right? So somebody mentions something and somebody might say, well, that begs the question of, and then what they have in mind is that, well, that makes me think of this further issue about which we have questions. And that use of begging the question isn't the begging the question fallacy, so it can be potentially confusing. But in this case, in the example I gave, and the original usage of the term begging the question is fallacious because it relies, as I said, on premises that are just as controversial as the conclusion that is being argued for. So in other cases where just, well, this raises some question, that's not an issue of a fallacy, that's just something else. It's a bit confusing because it's the same term, so try and keep those distinct. Begging the question, the fallacy, is something to avoid. It's a bad thing, at least from a logical point of view, and it's not something that you want to fall for. Now, sometimes begging the question fallacy is going to be more complex than the relatively simple example that I gave, so it won't always be easy to dig through all the premises and to try and figure out exactly what an argument is assuming, especially if it's presented in a disorganized way, just in conversation or something like that. But in principle, you should be able to do it, right? You should be able to sift through all of the all of the premises, try and identify what the supposed supports are for the conclusion that is being argued for, and ask yourself, well, is there any good reason to accept these premises? And if it turns out that no, and especially if those premises depend upon something similar to the conclusion itself, then you have a case of begging the question, and it's not a good argument. It's a fallacious one. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. Just a quick overview of begging the question. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.